So for this week, we are going to start by talking about brain rules. There is a ton in these chapters, or one chapter, whichever version of the book you have. The topic of memory in general is all really fascinating and interesting. However, not all of it is exactly applicable to the classroom. So, what we are going to do is discuss what aspects of the information directly pertain to our education profession. Okay, so the agenda, as you can see, is kind of packed, but we will be covering many topics. We're going to talk about mnemonic devices for memory, and we will spend the rest of the time on data driven writing instruction, and we're actually going to get some practice right here. Okay, so when it comes to memory, what does UDL suggest? Well, suggest a couple of different things. First, it suggests that as educators, as teachers, we create an accepting and supportive classroom environment where students are not made to feel bad for their deficiencies, for the areas that they struggle with. UDL also suggests that we vary the level of novelty or risk. Remember how we tried Padlet and that was fun for some of you, for others, it was a little frustrating. But if I were to start every single class with Padlet, not only would the novelty wane, but you would start hating warm ups. You also need to vary the level of sensory stimulation. Remember, we don't want to be so over energized and have all these chaotic activities, but we also don't want to underwhelm and understimulate our students. We need to have a really nice balance, and also we need to vary the social demands, and that looks like the following. Sometimes we are going to have to work with an elbow partner. Sometimes we're going to have to work in a cooperative group. So it varies from activity to activity, but this is what UDL suggests as best practices for supporting and enhancing the memory of our students. Okay, so one of the big takeaways from this chapter is that people forget 90% of what they learned in 3 days. I don't know about you, but that's pretty intense, right? What we need to figure out is how to get that content into our students' brain. I can tell you that the least effective way to do this is through lecture. Kind of what I'm doing right now, unfortunately. But you guys have had now a couple of classes with me, and hopefully you get to see that I do try really hard to engage all of you and have you actually being active participants in the content rather than lecturing on it. If we really want you to remember material, you have to get involved with it. And if we really want you to understand it, you have to work with the content. Just sitting and listening to someone talk is not going to help. This is just passive listening. So, a PowerPoint presentation is not the most effective way to learn. However, there are things you can do to make it more effective. You can add pictures, tell stories, and engage people in emotional content. Remember, we talked about this in our last class. Let me just pause for a second. Okay, and I am back. So, let me go from current slide. Okay, so memory is in general very complicated. We remember different things in different ways. I think you can all think about ways you have memorized different concepts in the past, and you may find that you have learned different content by either using flashcards, mnemonic devices, building things, or engaging with the content in one way or another. Our students may be really good at remembering one kind of thing, but not another. For most students, though, remembering things that have meaning is more successful than relying simply on rote memorization. Okay, So, building pathways in the brain. The book talks about building pathways in the brain, and I hope you all remember the story about the school and how they wanted to build pathways across the quad. Instead of putting down the pathways, the guy just left it and had the students build without pathways after. And do you guys remember what happened after that? I am going to pause the recording right now and give you some time to think. Okay, hopefully you guys remember what happened. But if you don't, well, the students actually started going to their classes and they started cutting across the grass, and they found the most efficient way to get to all their classes. And over time, they actually started taking those efficient routes, and before long, the grass had pathways in it made by the feet of the student, and the most efficient routes were the ones that were used to then build the permanent pathways by the contractors. So the thing about the story is that I think it's really relevant to our students with learning differences, because if a student puts down an inefficient pathway, if a student is trying to learn something and they don't learn it in the most efficient way right off the bat, or they learn it incorrectly, what we have to do as educators is now go back and redesign the pathway, which is a lot harder if you think about the story. Um, if they had done it that way, then they would have to go back and use bulldozers and dig up all the concrete, where they would, have to put new pathways. So sometimes students do put down mental pathways for learning, and they sometimes are not the most efficient, they go the wrong way. And so our job then becomes to reteach and support the students in creating new pathways, which again, it's a lot harder than laying down a good, efficient pathway from the beginning. So for us, our job becomes thinking about how to help our students understand the most efficient and effective way of getting their needs met in terms of learning. And that doesn't always come naturally to them. Okay. So, the book also talks about memory in three different ways. It talks about making memory elaborate, meaningful, and contextual. What does it mean to elaborate on memory? What did the book talk about in terms of elaborating memories to make them stick? Go ahead and pause the video for like 5 seconds. Try to think about what is it that the book said. Okay, I know that wasn't 5 seconds, but hopefully you held it longer than that. Um, so, if you recall, memory elaboration means to provide multiple handles, a lot of inroads into the content. Memory elaboration aligns well with UDL principles. Remember, the first component of UDL is representation. This is where we ask teachers to present the content in lots of different ways, and that is very much aligned with this idea of lots of handles. You might give lots of examples, visual explanations, audio examples, show videos, incorporate hands on objects, which is also known as realia. And hands on objects really help students look at the information much more clearly and very concretely. Give students a graphic organizer. Tell a story that will enhance a topic. These are all multiple handles, all that lead to that same topic. The more handles you can give them, the more likely the students are to remember the material. This is one of the reasons I love Brain Rules. It's so clearly aligned with UDL and what we believe is best practice in terms of teaching students with disabilities. This idea of elaboration or handles is also the principle behind good vocabulary instruction. That is, that we need to give our students lots and lots of opportunities to interact with the word in different contexts, and we need to give them all the different meanings and lots of different sentences so they have lots of examples and help them understand and remember the meaning of the word. Okay, that was elaborate. Okay. The next one is to make things meaningful. So, meaningful interactions help students remember. One of the biggest pet peeves of mine is when staff ask students to repeat after themselves in order to make a request, especially if they have limited verbal skills. They'll say, "Hey, Bob, say please, and then the student will go ahead and say please. However, this is the same as if I were to ask you to memorize a random vocabulary word in a foreign language. Remembering this random word in a foreign language is not necessarily meaningful, which does not help with generalization. So let's go ahead and do just a quick mental activity. Can you visualize 3 times 4? Take a second and see if you can visualize it. I bet you can make a mental image of 4 groups of 3 items on a table, right? You are creating meaning, which in turn strengthens your memorization of this multiplication fact. 3 times 4 becomes meaningful because you can actually visualize those items, on the table or wherever. Now let's think about 7 times 8. Can you visualize that? This one may be a bit harder to form a visualization, and therefore it will be difficult to form meaning. So what we have to do then is to help our kids find other ways to make things meaningful. There's a program called Times Tables the Fun Way that will help you to form meaning of any multiplication fact. Okay, so Timetables the Fun Way is a program that uses pictures and stories to help students remember multiplication facts. It takes out the rote memory component and transforms the memory into something meaningful. The only caveat with this program is that it does not teach the conceptual understanding behind multiplications, but it does put multiplication in a mnemonic device that makes it meaningful. So let me go to the next slide. This is an example of Timetables the Fun Way. So you can see right here, this is a story for 8 times 8. So snowman, go camping, and you can see there's a picture of 2-8 camping right here. The story states that it was the middle of winter and very cold, and the forest was quiet because all the animals were asleep for the winter. 2 snowmen decided to go camping. By the time they arrived, they were very cold and they found a pile of sticks. The sign said it was okay to use the sticks for the fire. They built a nice fire with the wood. The only trouble was that when they got close to the fire, they started to shrink. Do you know why? Of course, the kids would say, well, they melted, and you say yes, and you remind them of the story that goes with it, which is when 8 is with 8, they go camping and get cold, and they find sticks for the fire. 6 4 sticks for the fire. So 8 times 8 for 64. So you can see it's just a mnemonic device. It's a way of remembering that, but it's fun and one that really does work. Okay, so this 8 is supposed to be holding 6. This one's supposed to be holding 4. So 64. So I really recommend this program if you're working with younger kids. It would work for older kids, but they may not appreciate it because it's really not age appropriate. Okay. So in general, mnemonic devices are really important for our students. They are just ways to support remembering or memorization of information that may not be very meaningful to them. For example, and we discussed this, the acronym HOMES represents the 5 Great Lakes. Okay, the acronym ROY stands for the colors of the rainbow: red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. So here's some more memorization tools. In general, we can categorize information in many different ways. We can take the first letter of things we want to remember and put them together into a word. However, there are lots of things that don't necessarily fit really nicely into a word, and that is when we would make use of sentence mnemonics. So sentence mnemonics is where we can remember some things. So we discussed this a couple of classes ago. Every good boy deserves fudge. That actually is a sentence mnemonic for music notes, e.g. BDF. We will talk about peg words next week in class because it's hard to explain on a video, so we'll actually get to practice with it. But what I can say is that peg words are a really good strategy for remembering list of things. The other one is visualization. Visualization is something that we use a lot with other strategies, which actually enhances their potency. So for example, Timetables the Fun Way really uses visualization to reinforce and create new memory pathways. I had many of my students look at pictures of the stories, and we would, I would have them, for example, if we're looking at the snowman, really pay attention to the details, and then I would have them describe it to me because I really wanted to make sure that they were paying attention to the details. Sometimes I would have them draw the visual themselves to help them make a visual image that, they, again, building the memory pathways. Memory is another really powerful memorization tool to help create meaning of information that may not be presented within context. Adding information into a song form is a wonderful way to help anchor information into our memory. And then keywords. Use keywords to help retrieve more difficult words or concepts. Remember my example of Albany? I used all bunnies live in New York as a way to remember the capital of New York as Albany. So my keyword was all bunnies.